Hello my lovely photographers, welcome back to another video on the series about visual patterns. The series where we break down visual language into visual patterns so that we can better understand the heuristics of photography and how best to apply them to our work. And as always, if you have no idea what any of those terms mean, then feel free to check out the very first video on this series where I break down exactly what visual patterns are, what visual language is, and why you would use these structures over something like photography rules. And speaking of photography rules, today's video is going to be probably the closest we'll get to true traditional photography rules. What we'll be talking about in this video is the idea of composition, positioning, and layout. These things are extremely important in a photographer's toolkit, and we as photographers have the power to shift, to change, and to move elements within our composition in order to better serve ideas about like harmony and balance, chaos and disorder, and generally lay out our images the way that we see fit in our vision and in our mind's eye. So the place I wanted to start here first is the idea that getting good at positioning and layout and composition in photography is one of your very first steps, one of your largest steps and most difficult steps actually, in terms of really mastering photography and getting good at photography. Once you realize that you as the photographer have every single piece, every single element within your composition, within your control, and that you should be controlling all of the elements within your composition properly, once you realize this, it starts to really unlock this idea of how you put your images together. And what I'm talking about here is, just micro changes when you're out shooting. Maybe you shift your camera or tilt or pan your camera just a little bit to, adjust your subjects so that they fit maybe a certain structure a little bit better. Or perhaps you're taking, a couple of steps to the left or to the right to just shift that perspective. Or maybe you're moving a little bit further back or running down the road a little bit just to get a different perspective from the next photographer over to you. Whatever the case may be, it is this realization that every single element is within your control and that there are certain compositional structures in order to quickly help us create a sense of harmony and a sense of balance that we can use, that once you unlock this idea, it really starts to elevate your photography. Now, as I alluded to earlier, when it comes to this idea of composition and positioning, this is probably the closest to, I guess, like strict photography rules as we're gonna get just in general, because with what I'm about to explain, these compositional structures, right? These compositional rules have implied meaning with them. And you've probably heard me say that before if you've watched some of the other videos in the series. But with these compositional structures, these rules, they have certain meaning. And I guess the objective of them is for us to be able to quickly use these structures so that we can have a sense of balance, so that we can have a sense of harmony. And then if we want to break them, they can then have a sense of chaos or disorder, and neither of which are bad things. There is a time and a place for everything. But as I mentioned in past videos, do these things and break these rules with intention. Now, the very first compositional structure I wanted to talk about is probably something you've heard of before, and that is the rule of thirds. Now, the rule of thirds is probably the most common compositional structure you'll ever see. It's on every camera, it's on every piece of editing software, it's on every compositional tool out there, and for good reason. It does have a very simple usability to it, and it does have quite an effective use to it as well. So the bang for buck you get for using this compositional structure is quite high. All you need to do to use it is simply place your elements on the lines, and bonus points if you can place it on an intersecting set of lines as well. But doing so will increase the balance and the harmony and the rigidity of your composition and typically make it look a little bit better. So for example, this current frame that you're seeing right now is me on the third, on this one particular side. And that gives this image, this composition overall, a sense of balance. Now, in addition to the rule of thirds, of course, there are many other compositional structures that we can use to quickly help balance our images out. And of course, There are way too many to mention, but some of my favorites will start with the center compositional structure. Now, center is exactly what it sounds like. You place two lines vertically and horizontally, and they intersect each other in the middle. And usually you're placing your subjects in the middle of the frame. And this is perhaps the strongest compositional structure, as our eyes as viewers tend to gravitate towards the middle of the composition the fastest, and therefore it is the most recognizable when a element or a subject is placed there. Now, another great compositional structure is diagonals, which is just a series of diagonal lines which intersect each other that kind of create a rotated square in the middle. And placing, again, your elements on any single one of these points, intersecting or not, will typically result in a positioning and a composition that will look a little bit stronger than if they weren't to be on those lines. And then you have all of the golden ratio stuff. Now, when it comes to the golden ratio stuff, a little bit of a disclaimer. There are some people out there who, I guess, abide by the golden ratio for every single one of their images, swear by it, and that's totally fine if you want to do that. But there are also people who kind of, poo-poo the other compositional structures out there and, say that they're all not as good as the golden ratio. And to my eyes and in my opinion, this kind of elitist behavior is not warranted, not wanted, and just quite frankly, just not good and very close-minded. And if you are one of those people, you are not an elitist, you're probably a wanker. Now, every single one of the compositional structures is not going to fit every single image every single time, right? So the idea is to use these different compositional structures when it's relevant, when it's appropriate, and use the right tool at the right time, not just use one tool for all of the things unless it is a tool specifically made for that. Anyway, the golden ratio is a mathematical equation, a mathematical relationship between two elements that can be visualized in most compositions in the world and therefore retrofitted into most compositions as well. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best thing all the time, but it does appear in nature quite a lot. Now, it exists when we divide a line into two, part A and part B. And the longer part is divided by the smaller part, which equals the sum of the two parts divided by the longer part, which then comes to 1.618. Now, the math doesn't really matter at all, but what does matter is that the relationship of one side to the other creates a balance and creates a harmony, and that's what we're looking for when we're coming to use this particular structure. So the very most common compositional structure when it comes to the golden ratio is something that looks a lot like the rule of thirds, which looks like this. And you'll notice that it kind of looks like the rule of thirds, but it's actually the other way around. The rule of thirds was actually inspired or based off this golden ratio. It's just an easier version of it to use. But of course, this particular golden ratio works perfectly as well. Now, if you've been diving into this kind of golden ratio compositional structure a little bit, you've most likely heard of the golden spiral or the Fibonacci spiral. And this is also based on the golden ratio as well. Just as you can see, it is the 1.618 divided into itself many times. We can also use the golden triangle as a compositional structure as well, which is also of the very same idea. Now, again, it's important to mention that not every single one of these compositional structures will work every single time for every single image that you might have. Figure out what works best for you, play around with all of them, and come up with even a combination of them that might work for you best. That is the power of being able to, know all of these different structures and then know which tool will serve you the best and the quickest and the most efficiently when you're out there shooting in the field. So what I'll do is actually introduce you to what I personally use, which is a compositional structure that I created and I've been using for as long as I can remember. And it's a structure that I haven't seen anywhere else on the internet really, but it's a very obvious idea once I explain it to you. But basically what I do is I take a grid-like approach and I start with the rule of thirds, and then I overlay that rule of thirds with the center line, so both the horizontal and the vertical one. And then I take this giant structure and I replicate it 9 times, each through the 9 windows of the rule of thirds. And what you have at the end is this very grid-like structure where regardless of, well, for me anyway, regardless of where I place my elements or my subjects, as long as it's on a line of that grid or an intersection of that grid, it's going to look somewhat balanced and orderly. And this for me is a huge deal because it really speeds up my workflow and ensures that I can place elements in a harmonious fashion so that I can then spend the extra bandwidth that I have on things like making sure my subject is right, or making sure I'm adding additional visual patterns like contrast or juxtaposition or color into my images. And it frees me up a little bit more to be able to focus on the other portions of my composition. All right, so this compositional structure is something that you can definitely try out on your own workflow. And I would love to hear your experiences about whether or not you'd like to use it or not, or even if you're using any other compositional structures that you would love to share your stories about. I would love to hear those in the comments below. All right, that's it for this video on composition and positioning. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. But until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.